Good evening, I'm Katie Wilson and you're watching A News. Let's see your headlines. Donald Trump sets reciprocal tariffs on dozens of countries' exports. US envoy to visit aid distribution sites in Gaza after meeting with Netanyahu. Kyiv observes a day of mourning after massive Russian strikes. US President Donald Trump has imposed steep tariffs of up to 50% on goods from 69 countries as he pushes ahead with a self-imposed deadline to reshape global trade.
Well, they have to.
US President Donald Trump has imposed steep new tariffs on imports from 69 countries, including major partners like Canada, Brazil and India, as part of a broad effort to reset global trade terms. The tariffs range from 10% to 50%, with most set to take effect on August 7th, unless goods are already in transit. Under the latest executive order, Canada now faces a 35% duty, Brazil 50%, India 25%, and Switzerland 39%. All countries not listed in the order will be subject to a default 10% import tax. Goods loaded before August 7th and arriving by October 5th will be exempt. The administration also clarified that the tariffs are not cumulative, meaning countries like Brazil won't face double rates, but will still see effective duties rise as high as 50% on most goods. Canada's higher tariffs are already in force after missing the August 1st deadline. Trump accused Ottawa of failing to curb fentanyl smuggling and claimed its government was very poorly led. Mexico, by contrast, secured a 90-day delay after last-minute talks between Trump and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum. That pause avoids a 30% hike on most Mexican goods, but certain sectors remain affected, including a 50% tariff on metals and a 25% duty on cars and non-USMCA compliant items. India was hit with a 25% rate after negotiations broke down over access to its agricultural market. Trump also signalled penalties over India's oil trade with Russia. Meanwhile, China has until August 12th to reach a final trade agreement with the US after months of preliminary talks. A US official confirmed progress, but did not elaborate.
Well, today is the deadline for President Trump's trade deals, but few have materialised. Meanwhile, global partners are shifting focus, with Asia strengthening ties, Africa building self-reliance, and South America adjusting exports.
Today marks the deadline to land a trade deal, one that could define the next chapter in US economic policy. Back in April, after Donald Trump launched what he calls his Liberation Day tariffs, his administration boldly promised 90 deals in 90 days. But 120 days later, that ambitious tally stands at just 8, and even those remain vague in detail. But it raises a bigger question. If nations aren't rushing to the table with Washington, where are they looking instead? In April, as a response, South Korea, China and Japan held their first economic dialogue in 5 years, seeking to strengthen regional trade ties as all three Asian export powers brace for the fallout from US tariffs. Meanwhile, American companies are pulling back from China at record levels as tax hikes and rising tensions continue to reshape the economic relationship between the world's two largest economies. A new survey from the US-China Business Council reveals that just 48% of US firms plan to invest in China this year, a steep drop from 80% in 2024. The report also highlights a steady decline in optimism about China's economic prospects, alongside growing pessimism about any improvement in US-China relations. In Africa, countries such as Uganda are doubling down on efforts to build a more resilient, self-sufficient domestic economy. But beyond individual strategies, some African nations see opportunity in the shifting global landscape. This uncertainty could be the catalyst to finally establish the long-discussed regional value chains, allowing countries to trade more within the continent. And in South America, trade shifts are also underway. The region is rich in commodities, with Brazil and Argentina among the world's largest exporters of soybeans and petroleum. Now, with the US imposing tariffs on Chinese goods and China hitting back, South American nations may benefit. Brazil could expand agricultural exports to China to fill the gap left by US suppliers. Trump's latest deal with the EU could be a major win, averting a broader trade war by imposing a reduced 15% tariff on most EU goods. The agreement stabilizes relations between two economies that together account for nearly a third of global trade. However, the EU is still looking for trading partners in India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, and the Philippines.
Two top US officials are heading into Gaza this Friday to assess the worsening humanitarian crisis. The White House says the visit is aimed at improving food aid delivery to the war-torn territory.
Finding out firsthand what life is like for the 1.9 million people displaced in Gaza. That's what the US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff and Ambassador to Israel Mike Huckabee are doing on Friday. It's a rare visit by senior American officials to the war-torn Strip. The White House says they'll inspect food distribution sites and secure a plan to deliver more food and meet with local Gazans to hear firsthand about the situation on the ground.
The special envoy and the ambassador will brief the president immediately after their visit to approve a final plan for food and aid distribution into the region. And we will provide more details for all of you once that plan is approved and agreed on by the President of the United States.
According to United Nations aid agencies, food insecurity in Gaza is reaching catastrophic levels. The UN estimates that nearly 80% of the population is now reliant on international assistance. At least 147 people have died of starvation already, according to the local health authority, which says 88 of them were children. 1 in 3 people is now going multiple days without food, says the UN. Since late May, the UN Human Rights Office estimates more than 1,300 Palestinians have been killed while trying to receive aid. As the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate, Washington is under increasing pressure to ensure assistance reaches civilians quickly.
Over to Ukraine. Flags flew at half-mast in Kyiv as the city mourns 31 dead and 159 wounded in a Russian drone and missile attacks. 5 children, including a 2-year-old, were among the victims found after a 24-hour rescue. Authorities say 16 children were wounded, the most in a single attack on Kyiv since the invasion began. Over 300 drones and 8 missiles targeted cities beyond the front lines. President Trump called Russia's actions disgusting and warned President Putin to reach a deal by August the 8th or face economic consequences.
Nice to see drones, more than 100 people.
Ukraine's parliament has reversed a controversial anti-corruption law following nationwide protests. The rollback restores key agency powers and addresses concerns raised by civil society and international partners.
Independence to 2 main anti-corruption agencies in Ukraine has been restored. It's after there were mass protests around the country and in Kyiv in a rare show of discontent. The demonstrations were triggered after lawmakers, led by the ruling party, rushed through amendments last week defanging the respected agencies. Protesters were accusing the government of trying to shield political allies from investigation. To defuse a political crisis, President Volodymyr Zelensky has signed legislation restoring the powers of the National Anti-Corruption Bureau and the Specialized Anti-Corruption Prosecutor's Office.
It is very important that the state listens to public opinion. It hears its citizens. Ukraine is a democracy, absolutely no doubt.
Last week's law had expanded the Prosecutor General's control over corruption cases, allowing them to override or reassign investigations and sideline anti-graft prosecutors. Protesters called it a direct threat to Ukraine's fight against corruption, a key condition for European Union membership and critical to securing international aid. On Thursday, lawmakers voted 331-0 to undo the changes, a move welcomed by civil society and EU officials. Protesters say it was challenging to demonstrate on a night where missiles and drones were bombarding the city.
The night was difficult. I didn't sleep and it wasn't fun at all because of Russian attack. But I came here anyway, met some of my acquaintances that gathered today with one goal, and the goal was reached. So I am satisfied with this day.
It is important. Someone fights on the front lines. Someone should control the government. I am happy that young people came out and showed that it is not the way to go.
The rollback also exposed political fractures. One lawmaker told the Kyiv Independent that most party members supported the original law without understanding it, believing it came from Zelensky and had Western backing. One MP quit the president's party in protest. While activists say the reversal is a win for civil society, they warn that the anti-corruption fight is far from over.
Coming up after the break, we'll be discussing Trump's tariffs with Anna Evans, a Lisbon-based political analyst. Stay with us.
Ready to welcome everyone to come to Gabela and to make unforgettable memories.
Welcome to Gabala rafting.
This territory is the most important place in our history. Our ancestors lived here 2,000 years ago, and they had here amazing culture, amazing civilization.
There's something for everyone here. This place is the largest amusement park in Azerbaijan.
Our guests love to have meal in this atmosphere.
Yeah.
You know, you see you're in nature, in the forest, and the good food.
It's 6 tons, 579 liters.
And it's a lot of wine.
And biggest cask in the world.
Vandag is not just a holiday destination. It's a symbol of Azerbaijan's growing tourism potential.
The doors are open. Welcome to Gabala, Azerbaijan.
On World Business, we meet the boardroom leaders making market-moving decisions. And find out how leaders are dealing with continuous technological disruption.
Welcome back to A News. Now, let's dive deeper into the issue of Trump's tariffs and their possible impact on political and economic affairs. Anna Evans joins us from Lisbon in Portugal. Thank you for being with us, Anna. Now, how did global markets initially react to President Trump's new reciprocal tariffs?
Well, global markets are showing a mixed reaction, which is kind of expected because the issue of tariffs has been coming up cyclically for the past few months. And so whilst at the beginning, when President Trump, early in his mandate, started to talk about tariffs, there was like a real scare around the world, and in Europe in particular, and in Canada and in Mexico. That was his first time threat of tariffs. But since over the past few months, it is cyclical that President Trump gives another ultimatum and says, by the next date, we are going to impose tariffs if there is not a balance in trade. And so the world markets have gotten used to the usage of the tariffs as a strategy by President Trump in terms of negotiating a series of items that are important for the United States. So, for example, it was a tool to negotiate support with regard to immigration control with Mexico and also with Canada. It has been a tool, to negotiate the purchase of energy and military equipment by Europe, for example. And now, the countries that have been targeted by the new tariffs are also, for example, India is obviously not happy, but it is more quietly dealing with the issue and regarding it as part of an ongoing negotiation that can have sectoral derogations, sectoral exceptions, and it's not the end of a process. Rather, it is an ongoing process. For example,
does it not surprise you in that case that the market response has been relatively muted so far, despite the scale of this announcement?
Yeah, it doesn't surprise because corporations and investors, entrepreneurs, they adapt. Actually, in order to be resilient, all these actors thrive on adjusting to new contexts, new circumstances. And so, if someone who is a world leader is using this kind of investment strategic tool, a trade tariff, throughout a longer period of time with these cycles that create ultimatum, that teaches investors to adjust. So what we notice is that in the short term, so for example, before the deadlines, there is a lot of trade in specific elements. For example, there was very recently a very big rise in copper trade because of the expectation that copper would be affected by the tariffs. So what we notice is that before the deadlines, there are short-term patterns of trade that vary in preparing for possible impacts. And after, the announcement of the tariffs, there is some fluctuation, but as time goes by, this is a more muted fluctuation because the investors know that there will be further negotiations, that there will be further issues at the table. And as I mentioned, in Europe's case, for example, it has been very clear that President Trump wanted Europe to buy more energy and more military equipment from the United States. And so there are these lateral issues that are being negotiated, and different countries have different issues on the table depending on the trade that the United States has with those respective countries. So some analysts are saying that, when the United States has a very negative trade balance with countries, the tariffs tend to be higher than in cases where the trade balance is not so imbalanced. But other analysts are saying that it is not just economics, it is also the countries that make concessions to the administration, to the US administration, with regard to other aspects that are important to the administration, for example, weapons and energy in the case of Europe. These countries tend to get better results. So we also see that there are a range of possibilities in terms of bargaining and in terms of how to get President Trump to be softer on a given country.
So you've mentioned the short term. What about the long term? What specific concerns are investors raising about the potential long-term impact of these tariffs?
Well, I would say that there are two major concerns. One is with the inflation, the fact that products will become more expensive, and also with supply chain turbulence. So the fact that supply chains around the world will have to adjust to these fluctuations in tariffs and to these cyclical threats with regard to the tariffs, which then pose, of course, issues for investors and for the corporations. So one would expect that corporations that are most affected by the tariffs will want to diversify their export markets, and that will, of course, change supply chains, change the patterns, the flows, the locations, and how products are assembled, and where geographically the countries will import from and export to. So the investors are concerned that this will create uncertainty, but at the same time, that the corporations that are most affected by the tariffs will start by feeling, an impact, a negative impact, because it will become more expensive to export their products. However, they will adjust by diversifying their export markets. And so what we are seeing is that there is a typical aspect of changes in policy, and tax policy is one of these issues. So President Trump is trying not to raise taxes at home, but on the other hand, he is raising trade, tariffs. And so, as happens in other policy domains, each policy decision has, pros and contras. It has positive aspects. The US has been actually cashing in a lot from the tariffs, and that is, of course, from the point of view of the government, a positive aspect. But then there are the negative aspects of what other consequences there could be. So, for example, President Trump wants to reindustrialize the United States to fulfill his promises towards the swing states where the old industries are gone and, you know, the industrial capacity of those states within the country seems like a phantom. So President Trump promised he wanted to revive these industries. But at the same time, one knows that by implementing tariffs on products that are critical for reindustrialization, that does not necessarily help that reindustrialization. So again, you know, in all these policy decisions, there are complex elements of things that are positive for the administration, other aspects that will not be that positive. And then, of course, one man's meat is another man's poison. So something that might be positive for the administration might not be positive for essential sectors and the access to critical materials on which the United States depends to reindustrialize. So it is, in essence, you know, not very easily quantifiable in terms of long-term effects. You know, we know there will be changes, but it is very hard to tell, you know, if it will be as harmful as some are predicting. But on the other hand, nobody really knows.
What about the coming quarters then? Will the tariffs inevitably trigger inflation and disrupt corporate earnings?
Well, it depends on a lot of things, because the tariffs vary according to country. So the tariffs for Canada are not the same as the tariffs for the UK, for example. And so it varies with countries and it varies with sectors. And so there are a lot of sectoral derogations, sectoral exemptions, sectoral exceptions, you know, both ways, some with higher taxes, some with lower taxes. And so obviously, while we can say that those, for example, the automakers in Europe are concerned, the pharmaceutical industry in India is very concerned, and it is also concerned in Ireland, for example, or the gem industry in India is again concerned. We don't know, for example, what will happen with regard to China, which is a huge market. You know, the negotiations keep on going. And so it's like in many of these cases, because we have ongoing negotiations and we know that there are lateral tools for negotiation. There are lateral interests that President Trump is negotiating. It is really hard to tell, you know, if and how much impact this will have for each given country and specific sector. You know, I think it is really important to understand that this is one of those cases where politics governs economics. It does, because of complementary sectors and of the lateral bargaining that is going on, which is political bargaining using economic tools. So this is really important to have in mind, that this is not just pure trade flows, it is how is President Trump is calculating the side gains that the administration will achieve by using these threatening or coercive diplomatic tools. You know, this form of diplomatic coercion, which is the use of trade to get other benefits that are beyond trade, which can be in defense, in its own exports, in its own reindustrialization, and so on and so forth.
Now, you touched upon this already, and I'd love to get some more details on it. And how are investors reacting to this? How are they adjusting their strategies? Are they moving to safe havens, or are they buying the dip?
Well, I think it really varies because, as I said, when the whole process of strategic use of trade for negotiation started early in the mandate, in President Trump's mandate, the investors were really scared. And so we saw a lot of short-term selling. We saw a lot of, roller coaster on the markets. And we remember that pensioners, for example, in the United States, lost a lot in terms of the value of their pension packages because of the roller coaster that the threat of tariffs induced in the stock markets, and including those related to the pensioning system of the United States, which is a bit different from ours, for example, in Europe, and which is very, very heavily related to the stock market. So there was, at that stage, the investors panicked. There was a very clear roller coaster, and we remember that even Republican senators and representatives talked to President Trump because the devastation and the loss in terms of the markets was really worrisome, and those who are about to go to midterm elections and who have to prepare for the midterm elections in the United States were starting to be very concerned about the electoral impact that the tariffs might have.
Anna, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining us on the programme and for all of your insights. Now, after the break, we'll be back with key stories shaping the region. See you then.
Ready to welcome everyone to come to Gabela and to make unforgettable memories.
Welcome to Gabala rafting.
This territory is the most important place in our history. Our ancestors lived here 2,000 years ago, and they had here amazing culture, amazing civilization.
There's something for everyone here. This place is the largest amusement park in Azerbaijan.
Our guests love to have meal in this atmosphere.
Yeah.
You see you're in nature, in the forest, and the good food.
It's 6 tons, 579 liters.
And it's a lot of wine.
And biggest cask in the world.
Bandar is not just a holiday destination. It's a symbol of Azerbaijan's growing tourism potential.
The doors are open. Welcome to Gabala, Azerbaijan.
Good morning, you're watching A News Live from Baku to the world.
This is a long line of...
To truly understand this conflict, we need to look beyond the normal conventions.
Asia-Pacific region.
Well, this is a major development, not just for the governments of countries across the South Caucasus and Central Asia. Its impact is also increasingly being felt in Brussels, London and Berlin.
Inside Politics delves deeply into the heart of global issues shaping our world today. Join me for your go-to source of political analysis from across the region and beyond.
Welcome back. Now, let's take a closer look at the key developments shaping our region. Iranian President Masoud Pezeshkian has acknowledged his country's failure to build strong ties with neighbouring Azerbaijan. During a visit to Zanjan, Pezeshkian said Iran bears responsibility for the lack of stable relations with what he described as a brotherly nation, citing shared religious and cultural ties. He emphasised the need for unity among Muslim countries, especially neighbours, to prevent external interference and promote regional stability. Reflecting on his recent visit to Azerbaijan, Pezeshkian questioned why Iran has failed to develop close ties, while countries like Israel have gained influence there. He concluded that the shortcomings lie in Iran's own policies and called for introspection to improve relations with Azerbaijan. A ministerial meeting between Israel and Syria took place in Baku. According to news agency AFP, the talks focused on the security situation in southern Syria.
A high-level meeting between Syrian and Israeli officials took place on Thursday in Baku, Azerbaijan. Syrian Foreign Minister Assad al-Shaibani and Israel's Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer attended the talks. This followed a similar meeting in Paris last week. The focus was on southern Syria, particularly the aftermath of deadly clashes in the Swaida region. This isn't the first time Baku has hosted discreet negotiations. The Azerbaijani capital has hosted at least 3 rounds of dialogue between Israel and Turkey over military activity in Syria. Earlier this month, Syrian President Ahmad al-Sharaa paid an official visit to Azerbaijan. During the trip, the two countries signed agreements on post-war reconstruction in Syria and energy exports, including a plan to deliver Azerbaijani gas to Syria via Turkey. According to a Syrian source cited by I24 News, al-Sharaa also met with a high-level Israeli delegation in Baku. These talks highlight Azerbaijan's growing strategic location for hosting and facilitating discussions on conflicts in the Middle East.
Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan said that he welcomed recent steps taken by France, the UK and other countries to recognise a Palestinian state. President Erdogan expressed appreciation for the recent humanitarian responses from Europe, particularly from France and Britain, describing them as highly valuable. Speaking in Ankara, he said he had called French President Emmanuel Macron to congratulate him on his decision. Erdogan added that supporting a two-state solution would represent the most effective stance against Israel's policies. In Kabul, environmental cooperation took centre stage as Afghan and Kyrgyz officials met to explore new avenues for joint action. Our Afghanistan correspondent Tamim Bahis has more from Kabul.
Matiullah Khalis, the General Director of Afghanistan's National Environmental Protection Agency, held talks with Turdakon Sedikov, the ambassador of Kyrgyzstan, to discuss regional collaboration in combating climate challenges. The two sides emphasized the need for sharing technical expertise and experiences to protect their fragile ecosystems. Mr. Khalis stressed that collective regional action is key to safeguarding natural resources and promoting sustainable development. Kyrgyz ambassador echoed the sentiment, reaffirming his country's support for Afghanistan's environmental initiatives. The meeting comes at a time when Afghanistan is grappling with the severe consequences of climate change. According to the International Organization for Migration, nearly 5 million people in Afghanistan have been affected by climate-related disasters so far this year. Flash floods and avalanches in the first 3 months alone displaced around 175,000 people, nearly 80% due to climate events. Another 396,000 were forced to migrate due to worsening conditions, especially in rural areas. The United Nations reports that many families have lost their homes and are struggling to access clean drinking water. Afghanistan ranks among the 10 countries most vulnerable to climate change. Officials say that without sustained regional cooperation, the environmental crisis will continue to deepen. This is Tamim Bahis in Kabul for A News.
Now, Turkish archaeologists have uncovered a well-preserved council house in the ancient city of Laodicea, which is over 2,000 years old. It is believed to have served as a key political and judicial centre during the Roman era.
Hidden under the soil of western Turkey, a 2,050-year-old building has been uncovered, believed to be the main council house of the ancient city of Laodicea. And now, archaeologists have revealed one of its most important public buildings, a bouleuterion, where city officials gathered to make political and legal decisions. The building has a rare design, pentagon-shaped outer walls that form a hexagon inside. Names carved into the 17 rows of seats identify council members and local leaders, offering a direct link to how the city was governed.
We're talking about a 2,050-year-old structure. Considering it remained in use until the 7th century CE, this monumental building served Laodicea continuously for approximately 750 years, functioning simultaneously as an administrative hub, governmental centre and judicial complex.
Now, nearly 2,000 years later, this ancient council house is once again open to the world, helping us understand how the people of Laodicea lived, ruled, and kept order.
After the break, we'll be returning to those statements made by the President of Iran regarding bilateral ties with Azerbaijan. See you soon.
Join me, Nick Summerby, on A News. From my days playing in the Premier League to working as a broadcaster for the channels like Al Jazeera and beIN Sports. I've never been afraid to ask the tough questions to find out what's really going on behind the scenes of the world's biggest sports teams. We'll be taking you inside the latest stories, stats and dressing room secrets of the world's biggest teams.
What is power?
opinion is also...
Has leadership truly evolved, or are the old rules of geopolitics still pulling the strings behind the scenes? Who is really powerful? And what makes people feel powerless? Our new series explores the secrets, strategies, and consequences of power.
Welcome back to A News. Now, joining us to discuss the statements made by Iranian President Pezeshkian is Dr. Ayhan Sari, Assistant Professor at the Turkish-German University in Istanbul. Thank you for being with us. Now, President Pezeshkian admitted Iran's own failures in handling relations with Azerbaijan. What specifically could he be referring to here?
I think he refers directly to the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, because it's the first step where this relation got worse. And we know that in this war, Azerbaijan side was the right one, and Azerbaijan started a just war against the occupied Armenia. And as a country, it is very normal from Azerbaijan to expect support from its neighbors. And if a neighboring country, if Iran cannot support and assist her neighbor Azerbaijan in such a situation, how could a country trust its neighbor? And as Pezeshkian said, it was really failure of Iran. And after this incident, I think Azerbaijan saw Iran not as a cooperative neighbor, but as a security threat for his own country, because we know there was some evidence that Iran supported Armenia instead of Azerbaijan, and during this war it was a big security threat for Azerbaijan. After this incident, we know that Azerbaijan searched for other cooperation with other countries, with Turkey, with Israel, and influence of Iran lost its way in this very process. But at the end, it is really interesting that Iran accepted its failure, and after this acceptance, it could be a new white page between these countries, and maybe Iran could think some ways to help Azerbaijan with his just war and just struggle against Armenia and its occupation.
So how significant is that? How significant is that shift in rhetoric from Tehran? And you touched on this already, but what does this signal for future bilateral ties?
I think we can take it as the first step, because we know these statements must be followed with concrete policies. And if Iran started with such statements and accept its failure, then Azerbaijan and the whole region expects some concrete steps, some concrete policies. As I said before, maybe Iran could start with supporting Azerbaijan with their rightful and just statements, just arguments against Armenia. And if Iran, Azerbaijan, and Turkey, regional countries, show some stand against Armenia and Armenia's European supporters such as France, it could help Azerbaijan a lot. And after these types of concrete steps, Azerbaijan could start with a real cooperation and build trust between Iran and Azerbaijan again. But as I said before, it is not wiseful to think that Iran change their policy completely without seeing some concrete steps from Iranian side.
And how optimistic are you that we are going to see those concrete steps, or is this just merely symbolic?
I think Iran started to think and revise their regional policies after the war with Israel. In June 2025, we saw Iran Iran was really isolated in the region, and almost none of the regional countries tried to help Iran. And Israel and Iran stood very alone against Israel and lost a lot. And after this point, I think Iran started to revise their regional politics with her neighbors, with Turkey, with Azerbaijan. And from this perspective, I think we could be some sort of optimistic about some revision in Iran's foreign policy, starting with Azerbaijan.
So you mentioned that alliance with Israel, and how does Pezeshkian plan to balance regional alliances, particularly given that Azerbaijan's ties with Israel has caused tension?
I think Pezeshkian knows as a smart politician, if you do not cooperate with your neighbor, and if you pose some security threats to your neighbors, it's very normal that your neighbors search for other cooperation. As I said before, we saw that in the war between Azerbaijan and Armenia, Iran stood on the side of Armenia. And it's obvious that Azerbaijan seeks new cooperation, and one of the new cooperation that Azerbaijan found was Israel. And if Iran wants to balance Israel's influence on Azerbaijan, then he must give some alternatives. And that's exactly what I mean with concrete steps. If Iran gives some concrete steps in Azerbaijan's struggle against Armenia, then the influence of Israel will decrease, and if Israel's influence will decrease in the region, it will obviously benefit also Iran's foreign policy.
So let's stick with Iran's foreign policy towards the South Caucasus. Do you see Pezeshkian's presidency marking a lasting change as far as that's concerned, especially in regards to the Zangezur corridor?
I think they understood after the war with Israel, they must make some changes. And it should start with their neighbors because, as I said in my previous statement, none of Iran's neighbors were willing to help Iran. Why? Because Iran had always an enemy position and adversary position to their own political gains. And starting with Caucasian, starting with other parts of the region, Iran must make some changes, because if they don't, it is really a possibility that we see another war between Israel and Iran, and in the next war, they could maybe not survive as they did in June. So from Iran perspective, they must make some dramatical changes in their foreign policy, find new alliances, and then build new alliances, build new influence, strength against Israel. And that's why I am somehow optimistic that we could see some changes in Iran's foreign policy.
And what role could economic and cultural cooperation play in resetting the tone between these two countries?
As we all know that Pezeshkian has a Turkish heritage, he can speak very well Turkish, and he wants to build a good relation with Turkish countries, Turkish-speaking countries. I think Iran could start with economic and cultural similarities and try to build trust again that Iran lost in the last decades. I think this is a good starting point, but we know also that in this region where we live, Azerbaijan, Turkey, Iran, culture, economic, this type of relations are important, but the most important one, the most significant one is always the security one. And if Iran wants to build a real trust, a real cooperation, real alliance, then they should also try to build some security cooperation with Turkey, with Azerbaijan. For example, Azerbaijan had really hard, difficulties with Iran in his war against Armenia. And Turkey has real difficulties with Iran in his war against PKK, terror organization PKK. So in this type of problems, policies, Iran must make some changes. Then this cultural, economical relations could also help to build a new alliance.
So this goes beyond the South Caucasus potentially, and it's a question for Turkic countries.
Yes. We saw that Iran was really alone in his war against Israel, and we know that Iran has two big neighbors, Azerbaijan and Turkey, both Turkish countries, Turkish-speaking countries, and we know that there are approximately 20 million people, Turkish people, who speak in Turkish, and there are also many Azerbaijan Turkish people in Iran, so they could start with this relations. But as I said before, it is always important to have also security alliance, because if Azerbaijan or Turkey has some security concerns towards Iran, it is not possible to build a real friendship. If Iran wants a real friendship, if Iran wants to revise its failure policies, then they should start to understand what Azerbaijan, what Turkey wants, and then they could build a new alliance in South Caucasus and in the whole Turkish region.
And what's your prediction for how this will develop, not only in the short term, but as a longer term foreign policy?
I think the threat that Israel poses to Iran is a game changer. And we saw that Iran's regime almost collapsed in the war in June 2025. And if states face these types of existential threats, then it is normal that we accept that this country makes some dramatic changes. And in short term, they could start with this type of statement that they've done in the past, this failure, that failure, and that they want to build a new friendship. And then they should, in the midterm and long term, try to show some concrete step. Again, I want to repeat myself. From the Turkish perspective, do not support PKK terror organization. From the Azerbaijan perspective, do not support Armenia. It is in his unjust war, occupation war against Azerbaijan. With this type of dramatic changes, we can accept that Iran's Azerbaijan-Turkish relation could be better in the mid and long term.
Thank you very much for your insights and for being with us on the programme.
Thank you.
That's all we have for now. Thank you for watching and stay tuned to A News.